What's up, everybody? My name is Ian Martin Allison. I'm here doing another special solo episode. I'm not going to disparage it and be like, B Squad, because that's not how I really feel. I'm gonna propose that it is a special episode of the podcast. Solo podcast. Check it out. Look, this is going to come out way later than I record it, but we just finished this unbelievable event called Bass Space 2022. Hopefully you were there. If you're not there, I think you can go online and still have access to the recordings if you're an SBL member or you become one. But it was ambitious and it was super incredible. It was 3 days. We did it over July 15, 16, 17, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. The whole team crushed it. But Lydia on the team, shout out to you, Lydia. Holy crap. Pulling the whole thing together was insane. Shout out to Nick, too, who organized so many artists. But see, stupid. I start to name names and then people are going to feel left out. Just those are the only names I'm going to name other than Scott to tell you that it was unbelievable. We even had merch made. I mean, is your boy drinking a delicious hot cup of coffee out of the Bass Space 22 mug? Now, look, if you're just listening to the pod, you're not seeing this unbelievable mug, my new favorite mug. I'm holding it to the screen. Yeah, I am. You're checking it out. Bass Space 2022. Oh, I got a hot cup of coffee. It's hot in Minneapolis, but I still like to drink hot coffee. And I'm sorry for all of you that are grossed out by slurping sounds. I won't do it again. Also, hold on. Can we just talk for a minute about this drippy pink hoodie? I mean, is this like the coolest hoodie you've ever seen or what? I mean, even though my wife is like, you can't wear pink because it's too close to your color, like your entire coloring, I just sort of feel like I am pink. Like my skin, my beard, everything about me is sort of pink. But for some reason, when I put on this pink hoodie, it feels like pretty drippy. I don't know. You know, we have a merch store. What am I just selling today? I'm so sorry. It didn't start out with this intention. Truly. So look, you can go to the merch store though. And I was amazed, like getting all this merch before the event. I was like, oh, I got to get some SBL stuff because I got to wear it for the event, right? And then I saw all these colors and patterns and stuff. I don't feel like we talk about it enough, actually. But do you need a good hoodie in your life? Do you need shirts, coffee mugs, hats? Do you need cool stuff with cool branding and design on them? We have those things at the merch store, so check it out. Scott's Bass Lessons, maybe /store? Ooh, boy. I actually don't know. But if you go to the site, you can, of course, check out the store and go shopping. We're getting new stuff all the time, too. New cool colors, new designs. So check it out. I'm quite taken with my pink hoodie. Yeah, dude, I look good. No matter what my wife says, yes! So, here's the deal. We've been promising for a long time, Scott and I, on the Scott and Ian show, currently today, just the Ian show, right? That we would talk about amp sims and, you know, like amp simulators inside of a pedal, amp simulators inside of a plugin, versus the real thing, right? Like, what's better? Is the amp dead? That's what I'm calling this podcast episode. Is the amp dead? Now you're going to see that. You're going to click on it. And then, of course, you know that I'm going to tell you, of course, the amp isn't dead. And then it's like, roll the credits. Da, 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 da. Right? Is the podcast over now? Is the amp dead? No. And then just roll credits. We're done. But I have more to say about it. It's more nuanced than that, truly. I tend to think about this debate just in terms of context. What context do you play in? Do you play in a variety of contexts? Are some gigs more suitable for the amp thing and some gigs more suitable for the amp sim thing, or, you know, using a pedal that has some kind of amp simulation built in? I even know people that are now bringing their laptops to gigs and the whole amp setup is in the laptop, and then they're using an interface to feed a powered monitor or front of house or something. That is happening now all the time. And it is not uncommon, and it is not bad, and it is not weird. It just depends on the gig, right? Oh, it's so hot, you guys. But I'm going to commit to the hoodie. I'm committing to the hoodie. I'm not taking it off. I'm committing to it, but it is so hot in Minneapolis right now. Even I got the AC running. I got my door open, so sorry. You might hear a little room noise. But it's just the way it's going to be because it is blazing. It is blazing hot outside right now. So I'm sorry for the little extra echo on the sound, but your boy's got to stay cool. Your boy's got to stay cool. And it's the only way with that door open and the AC coming in. Back to it. Now, if you've gotten this far, you're probably interested in this debate. But if you've gotten this far and you don't actually yet know what I'm talking about is this idea that the amplifier is no longer useful because now we have simulators in pedals that sound like amps and actually sound convincingly a lot like amps that they're trying to recreate, and it gets better and better every day. So you see some people saying, oh no, it's got to be the real thing, but then you also see people that have used the real thing for a long time say, I don't use the real thing anymore because the amp sim is just as good, or in some ways I prefer it. So that's what we're going to talk about. Now, I'm using the word sim, that means simulator. I probably didn't need to say that, but I thought, I just want to make it very clear, crystal clear, all about clarity. You know how I said I wasn't going to take a sip of coffee again? I lied. I lied to you. Tried to make the slurp less, though. Direct eye contact coffee drinking? Is that weird? It's a little weird for me, and I wasn't on the receiving end of it. All right. Here's the deal. I love amps. Oh, God. Do I love amps? I love amps. Do I love amps? Yes. I love amps so much. I went on a crazy amp hunt years and years and years ago where I was trying to find the best amp. I've maybe alluded to this in other episodes, but there was a time where I was buying, I was trying all different kinds of amps, right? Solid state amps. That means amps that have no tubes in them. Then amps that are hybrid, that have a tube in the preamp, but then their power section, what feeds the speaker, is all solid state, no tubes. And then, of course, all tube amps. Ooh, what some people, especially guitar players, consider to be the holy grail, right? Where everything is in a tube stage and it's just warm and beautiful. And the notes, you hear people say, oh, the notes sound 3D, like, oh, all this weight, yet definition and chewiness. People try to describe sound with the craziest words. But I remember hearing, oh, all tube amps are so 3D. And I thought, I want to be enveloped in 3D bass. That's something that I want in my life. So I went hard down that road. And I've discovered a lot of things. So I'm going to talk to you about my experiences with amps, with amp sims, with software amps, with amps inside a pedal like I use on the HX Stomp, and what I find to be useful, frankly, about all of them in different contexts. But let me first tell you this. Like anybody, I started out on a cheap little crappy practice amp and then graduated to bigger and bigger things. But when I got amp obsessed is when I really started to wonder about the classics. Like when someone would say SVT, I thought I knew what that meant. I thought it was like grindy, like distortion. When someone say like, oh yeah, like a big SVT, just rock and roll, just cranked up and just grinding. I thought, oh yeah, that's going to be a gainy, big distorted sounding amplifier. And then I got one. And to make an SVT distort without plugging things into the front of it like other pedals or whatever, just to turn the volume knob, like especially a non-master volume SVT, like one of the original ones that just has one knob for volume, that's adjusting both gain and volume. Or maybe gain is fixed and it's just adjusting volume. I'm not sure. But to get that thing to distort, you have to turn it like all the way up, or like up to 7. And it's a 300 watt tube amp. And tube amps, here's the thing. I don't know the math. I'm not going to do the math. You never do public math. Don't ever do public math. But here's the thing. Tube watts are louder. I'm quote unquote louder than solid state watts. So a solid state amp that says it's 1,000 watts, a 300 watt SVT will murder that amp in terms of just perceived volume. So when you turn an SVT up to 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 or 11 or whatever, it's frickin' loud, hey. It is super loud, where like the speakers can't handle it, and then you're wondering if you're hearing distortion from the amp itself or from the speakers. And I remember playing an amp super loud in a store when I was a kid, and like this, concerned sales guy running over to me like, what are you doing? And I'm like, well, it's not distorting. And he's like, well, right, it's an SVT. I said, yeah, but an SVT is supposed to distort. He said, no, it's not. It's like the cleanest bass all-tube platform ever. And I was like, what? And so what happens is the danger, it's not really a danger. It's not like I'm about to say like not knowing about the actual amp is dangerous, but it's certainly not as dangerous as stepping out into traffic, not having looked both ways. It's certainly not as dangerous as, eating just a lot of candy with red or yellow number 5 dye for 40 years. It's certainly not as dangerous as smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. No judgment. Just listen. It's not dangerous, right? It just might guide you in an odd direction. I think the important thing about at least knowing about amps is it gives you context for how to think about the Sims. So many people, and especially like younger players that just haven't had a lot of experience with amps, they see an amp in a software component or pedal, and they think that it's something that it isn't. Like for the longest time too, I thought Marshall plexis or Marshall amps were high gain amps, and they're not. And so to try to wring that out of them is maybe not always useful. Just like I was trying to get like a ton of distortion out of an SVT. That's not the thing. A great thing for an SVT is to turn it on to a moderate volume, not expect it to distort, and then run distortion into it. Oh man, is that an unbelievable sound. Unbelievable. Now they also sound really good turned up to 6, 7, or 8, but you can't play anywhere unless you're in a massive festival outdoor gig or something. I mean, there's no way you could play most stages, even big stages, with an SVT dimed. And yet people talk about SVTs like as this raucous, raunchy rock and roll thing, right? Same thing with the B15. I mean, another Ampeg. So the Ampeg made the SVT. Ampeg also made the B15. Oh, it's in every studio, right? And you hear about the B15 and how amazing it is. And then I bought a B15. I have it. It's just there. I'm pointing at it right now. And you find that there is no way that you can gig with one, because it's only about 30 tube watts, and it's, a smallish cabinet, a single 12. No, incorrect. What's it called, Ian? Ian, was it called a B12? Oh, no, Ian, that's right. It's called a B15, dude. Come on. Single 15-inch speaker in a cabinet, right? There's a single 15. It's a fairly small cabinet. The 60s ones were smaller. The 70s ones are a little bigger. But it's only about a 25 to 35 watts, depending on how you bias them and depending on the model and the era. And they just can only get so loud without them turning into sort of like Fart Town. Now, do you want to go to Fart Town? Maybe you do, but not always, right? You don't always want to go to Fart Town. So I bought a B15 thinking, oh, this is going to be it. So I bought a SVT. Oh, this is going to be it. Oh, wow. It's not distorting like I thought it was going to. Interesting. Now I have to put it into a different context in my mind. Oh, I'm going to get a B15. Yeah, lower wattage. Ooh, it's going to distort faster. It's going to be amazing, powerful on a gig. Ooh, wow. Get it on a gig. Like it just gets buried under a loud drummer, even a medium volume drummer. Oh, wow, so the B15's not the thing either. Oh, wow, okay. So context. Both of those amplifiers need to live in their own contexts. Ampeg SVT turned up to 2 or 3, beautiful, warm, clean, gooey, 3D, all those things. It's a wonderful sound. Plugged into an 810, like Scott will say, there's not a better bass sound out there for an amp. It's wonderful. But it didn't do the thing that I wanted it to do, which was go... B15. Again, another excellent low volume amp, really low volume coffee shop in the studio with a nice microphone on it. Fabulous sounding amp, but not one that you want to gig in your rock band, right? And so for me, it was wow, it was all this learning, but what that learning enabled me to do was treat those amplifiers in a similar way in a sim platform. So like not expecting all the distortion to come out of an SVT, right? And then with a B15, not expecting the right kind of distortion to come out of it, not, because they're pretty ratty when they get turned up all the way or turned up, to 4 or 5 or whatever. It's not like a pleasant distortion. It's like a farty distortion. And maybe that's cool as a layer, but maybe you back it off a little bit and let it just be what it wants to be, which is a warm, sort of low power, low volume amp. But hey, what's amazing about a sim is that then you can just turn it up. So if you're using a B15 simulation in something on a recording, perfect, because it doesn't need to be, you don't have to have the volume loud, right? Because you're recording. But even on a gig, if you're using a simulation in some kind of pedal, wow, and you're plugging into a PA or you're plugging into a different sort of power source and using maybe a big power amp or something for your amp, or just wedge monitors, then you can turn it up. You don't have to worry about the limitations of the real thing. But the real thing matters in terms of how you get to know the sound of the product. Now, that said, do you have to know what all these are to use them in a sim platform? Of course not. You can just fire up an SVT and just do whatever. And maybe a case could be made that not having knowledge makes you sort of more free about it on the platform. Like, wow, I can just do whatever. I mean, SVT, I don't know. Let's see. And let's start turning knobs and make it do whatever you want to do. There could be a case made for that as well. But I really find that when I like to have some knowledge of what that amp was designed to do and what it was made for and how best it sounds in its natural, real analog habitat before I explore it in a sim platform. Now, before getting to talk to you about all the amp sims and stuff that I like and how I use them, let me just tell you just a little bit more about my journey with amps, okay? So that wasn't enough for me. It wasn't enough. Oh, I had to have more. Did you have to have more, Ian? I did. I had to have so much more. So I went on the hunt for the Holy Grail amplifier. And at the time, on the forums and Talkbase, Sadowski had just made this all-tube amp called the SA200, 200 watts, but also with big power transformers in addition to the tubes. So kind of this hybrid between fast, big, punchy, high headroom, transient response. Don't those words sound great? In the power section, but also combined with that gooey, warm, 3D, luscious tube sound. You hear about this and you just think it's going to change your life. And I remember I found one. There was someone selling one and it wasn't cheap. And I remember saying to my wife at the time, Emily, she's still my wife. She had just crossed the threshold at that point from being a girlfriend, fiance to wife. And she was still very invested in my like gear acquisitions. There's a time, like, okay, check it out. There's a time in every relationship, like with your spouse or significant other or whatever, where they pay attention and they're really excited. Like, ooh, I'm like, hey, I think I want to buy this bass. Like, oh, wow, cool. Like, what color is it? Or like, ooh, how's it going to sound? Is it going to be different than, yeah. And you think like, oh, they're so in this. Then they realize after you've bought 20 instruments and 15 amps that you're just a hopeless addict and they don't want to engage with that behavior anymore. This is before that. But it was right on the precipice of crossing that line in our relationship that I showed Emily this beautiful tube amplifier by Sadowski. Oh, so beautiful. SA200, delicious. I show it to her. Check it out. She's like, wow, it's cool. It's pretty. And it is. Oh, they're so beautiful. They look like a library or something. They look like a beautiful building. They're so architecturally lovely, I think. I don't know, whatever. It's just a big metal rectangle, but still, dude, I love the way they look. And so big, huge, like aluminum knobs on them too, just black aluminum knobs. So cool. Anyway, Emily says, so why are you getting that? Like, don't you have an amp that works? And I was like, oh, yeah. And at that point I had so many amps, because I'd gone down, okay, the all tube thing, but then of course I've got amps that are hybrid, that have a tube preamp and solid state power amp, and I'm trying all the things, and I have a ton of that stuff. And she's like, so why are you getting that? And I was like, because it's the best. And she was like, oh, really? It's the best? And I was like, yeah, it's like supposed to be the best amp. And she was like, well, why do you need that? And I was like, didn't you hear the words that just came out of my face? Because it's the best. And she's like, yeah, but why do you need the best amp? And I was like, I don't understand what's happening in this conversation right now. I'm fairly sure I've told you now, this is going to be the third time that I've told you it's the best. And she's like, what I'm saying, Ian, is that I thought that it's about your playing. Like, do you need the best amp? Like, if you're a good bass player, who cares, kinda, right? Like, who cares about the amp? And I was like, well, but it's the best. But babe, it's the best. She's like, oh, okay. And then I was like, as the truth of her words were about to enter my ears and subsequently brain and subsequently heart and subsequently limbs and appendages and subsequently wallet, the words were coming. And I smacked him out of the way. I said, get out of here, words. I'm buying the best amp of all time. Woohoo! And I did. And I bought that SA200, and oh, do I still have it? Yes. Has it caused me headaches over the years? Yes. What happened was, it was perfectly fine when I got it. It had lovely tubes in it. It was so amazing. And then I decided to get crazy and start to swap the tubes. Oh, I was at a buddy's house trying different power tubes in it, trying different preamp tubes in it, really trying to like maximize the tone. Oh, this is the best amp ever. And now I really need to maximize the tone out of this thing. And I got all the best tubes inside of it. Oh, I'm so proud of myself. All those tubes that I got. And then I'll never forget, I had it on a gig, and I know that I've told this story before on the pod, so please excuse me. But for those of you that are new, welcome to my dementia. I got it on a gig. We're playing something like, it's a wedding. And I haul this thing out to the wedding. We're playing like Brown Eyed Girl or like Don't Stop Believin' or Uptown Funk or something. And just one of the tubes went, and the whole amp just stopped working. It just stopped working. Did it continue to work? It did not. It just completely stopped working. And I thought to myself, I am such an idiot. This is insane. This thing that I have spent so much time and energy and money and just like an embarrassing amount of all of those things. And now it just doesn't work. And now who's the asshole? Oh, that's right. It's me. Fingers all pointing right here. So many fingers pointing right here at me. I am the asshole because I brought the stupid fancy boutique amp, right, that I had like changed. when I got it, it was fine. It didn't need to be changed, but then I changed it, right? And whatever. And then I go into a passive DI and I play that for the rest of the night, and it was fine. But boy, the band was not pleased. I mean, whatever. It's a band of friends, and not whatever, like I didn't care. It's just there weren't a lot of consequences because it wasn't like a super pro level gig. My friends, we were playing at a wedding, right? But still, there became this thing of like, uh-oh, is that fancy new thing that Ian brought going to work? Ooh, you want to get rid of that. Oh boy, if you have a career, you want a career in this instrument, and people think that you're the gear guy that doesn't quite work. I used to work with this guy that would run tracks in a church context. He always brought Ableton sessions, and he had always done some big OS update like the night before the gig. You know what I mean? And he would bring his computer in, and it just would never work. And then he became known as the guy that always brought the computer that never worked. And you do not want to be known as the guy or girl to bring the piece of gear that doesn't work. oh dear Lord. And I could just see I was about to cross the threshold into that zone, right? Also, one other thing that happened with this amp is that I played a gig in Minneapolis, and I was on a stage opening up for a band called The Droppers. Legendary Jim Anton is in this band. Jim Anton's so sick. Such an amazing player. And I think I've alluded to this as well, but it bears repeating, you guys. Bears repeating. I'm up there with that amp and fancy everything, whatever, fancy cables and pedals and all that stuff. I haven't been able to give up the fancy pedals yet, right? But I have all this stuff, and the great Jim Anton, who has played with Prince, played with Johnny Lang, played with a bunch of amazing pop artists out of Los Angeles. I think Mandy Moore came up to the edge of the stage and said, wow, fancy amp, man. That's a beautiful amp. I said, oh, thanks. And I had that SA200. It was connected to a 610, a Bergantino 610. Great stuff, right? I'm not at the stuff. It's great stuff. It's just that it says something about you. It says that you care a lot about the money you spent on your rig, right? And he goes, wow, man, what a rig. And I said, oh, yeah, thanks. I said, you'd be welcome to play it for your set if you want. And he was like, oh, it's fine. Thank you, man. But I'm just going to use the house amp. I'm like, what? I didn't even know there was he's like, yeah, over here. And it was a Line 6 low down 10, which was like a little 10-inch combo that tilted back like a wedge monitor. And I said, you're going to use that? He was like, yeah, I'm just going to use that. It actually sounds pretty good. And I was like, oh, okay. And we play our set. I was probably a little too loud. Sound guy probably didn't have me in the house much. Our set was fine. Indie rock band in Minneapolis that I played in for a long time. And the set was fine. It was just fine. It was a B minus, maybe a B. I'd give it a B. Sure. A B? Yeah. It was a B. Then the Droppers got on, Jim Anton, and proceeded to murder. A+ set. And Jim put on a masterclass in bass playing and tone. He was playing a chopped up, literally like a pawn shop. I'm not talking like Fender pawn shop that you buy that's like the pawn shop series. Nah. I'm talking about actually a Mustang that he bought from a pawn shop that had like a, jazz bass pickup, like poorly routed, you're like too close to the bridge. You know what I'm saying? One of those kind of things. Playing that low down 10 at a very reasonable volume. So he was pushed up, pushed up, pulled up in the PA, whichever you please. And it sounded unbelievable. He took a solo that was like, it changed my life because I saw that and I thought, he's not as worried about his frickin' gear, dude. He's not thinking about it. He's playing the bass. And it's something that I desperately still need to this day, to keep in mind. Why am I talking about this? I'm going to start talking about Sims here in a minute, but listen, context is so important. So when people ask me, what's the best amp? I've talked about this with Scott too before. It depends. What are you doing? What kind of music you making? What kind of room are you in? Right? In that situation, my amp, supposedly the best amp, was the wrong thing. Too much bottom end, too boomy and bloomy in this big sort of hollow brick room that I was playing. Whereas Jim Anton was focused on clarity, hearing his note, speaker pointing up at his face from a small little 10-inch combo, not facing the crowd, and then getting it through the PA for the audience. What's the best amp? What is the best amp? The best amp is the one that you bring based on your discretion of what you're doing and where you're playing. That's the best amp, right? So it's trial and error. It's so much about like the room and if you're going to be in the PA or not. It's so much about that. Now, if I'm outside on a big festival stage, like I got to do a bunch of stuff with Eric Hutchinson where things were backlined. I've had Aguilar rigs that have sounded amazing. I've had Ampeg rigs, big SVTs that sound amazing. But if I'm in a little room and we're not playing like a full-on show, I don't want a giant amp cranked up, right? I want the right thing for the room. I'm still struggling with that though, because I do admire the aesthetic of an amp. I think amps just look badass. I am almost now more interested in the way an amp looks on stage than how it actually sounds. Because all amps now, like people are like, what's the best amp? It doesn't matter. Ashdown, Aguilar, Ampeg, Bergantino. I'm just going down the alphabet now, I guess. I mean, right? Like so many different things. Mark Bass, Peavey, Trace Elliott, TC Electronic. They all make Noble. I have a Noble head that I love. They all make great, great amps that sound fantastic. How do you want it to look? I mean, that's like a huge part of it for me. So, is the amp dead? Certainly is not dead. It certainly is not dead. And just when I think that the amp might be dead, and I haven't played a lot of gigs or something where, the amp is important, I do something like I did last weekend where I go with my friends in a cover band to play at a party. I go there, I've got a little 212 cabinet, I've got my Noble head, right? My 212 made by Javier Sinobas, who isn't making cabs anymore, which is such a bummer because it's such a great cabinet. But shout out to Javier, man. Such a cool cab. I've got my Noble on top. I've got a little rig and it feels good. And I don't care so much about me. That's not true. I do. I care what it feels like to me, but I also really want the rest of the band on stage to be able to hear it, but not have it be overwhelming. Like I want to make the context of the gig feel great. I don't want to make the sound man mad by turning it up too loud, but I also want it to be loud enough to where the drummer's like, yeah, or responds to what I'm doing. So I'm really looking for the band to give me feedback on whether the amp is sounding honestly, if it's just the correct volume and levels of low end and definition, right? And a lot of amps can do that. But this is going to be my transition to the Sims. We played with a guitar player that we don't normally play with named Alex, and Alex is awesome. Alex, if you ever listen to this, man, you're awesome, and I love playing with you. And Alex is a new breed, dude. Alex brings that digital rig, dude. Alex had, I don't know, Fractal or something, and then he had a little monitor that he was monitoring it through. And he's got all the sounds, and he can dial up all the sounds. I mean, beautiful sounds, a great player, great facility. But it just sort of over the gig, as everything just got a little louder and maybe people bumped their amps up. The other guitar player in the band is my dear friend Dave Young, who has a killer, I don't know what that thing is. It's a beautiful combo, Tone King or Victoria or something, but just killing sounding amp. And the band just got too big for that digital rig to keep up. Now, obviously, if Alex wanted to turn it up, he could have, right? If Alex wanted to, bring a different monitor, would probably solve that situation, right? And I even talked to him about this after the gig. But what I said was, dude, I get it. The sim thing is so cool because you have so much control. You can play through this amp to get that Brian May thing for the Queen tune we're going to do. Oh, you can use this delay and play through this amp for, when we do Shut Up and Dance or whatever, right? But the problem was, at least in the way that I perceived that at that gig, is that there was a small dynamic range that rig was occupying, and that when you needed it to go, it wouldn't go in the same way that an amp, just turning an amp up a little bit, or stepping on a pedal to excite the tubes in your amp, right? Or doing something to really step out in a moment. And I think guitar players in particular need to have the ability to play a guitar solo that is bang, especially live. I sometimes find the guitar players should almost double their solo levels. When they kick on a solo patch, it should be it should make a statement. You should go, yo, that is, yeah, you know what I mean? That is a thing. And I didn't feel it out of that rig. And it's interesting because we have our normal guitar player, Carl Koopman. Carl Koopman, shout out, man. He brings an amp. And I will say, I've had the opposite with Carl sometimes, where sometimes it's too loud, but I want live. I want the musicians that I'm with. If it's an amp gig, I want there to be ability to have that horsepower jump when needed, and not to always be playing too loud, not to always be overdoing it in the room, but to when you need to, like, for instance, for me, when I need to bust out that bass break in Can't Stop the Feeling by Justin Timberlake, I step on a fuzz and a drive and a chorus and an envelope filter, and that shit is loud. Because that moment needs to be a feature, right? That moment where it breaks down, boom, 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 that needs to be like big and nasty and awesome. And I feel like if I was just doing it in software with a wedge, I don't know if I'd have that same, but hey, 43-year-old guy talking here, who knows? Maybe it would be just fine. But I remember just saying to Alex, like, hey man, this is a context in which a real amp might serve you really well. Now, maybe it's about building patches and maybe assigning those lead levels hotter than you think. Maybe it could all be solved in a digital platform. But I think it's important to know the context you're going into. Know the context. So Alex, if you ever listen to this, dude, you were telling me that you had a boogie. Man, bring the boogie the next time, dude. You don't get an opportunity to use that stuff much anymore in these contexts. We're sort of an old school band. We're not on in-ears, right? It's amps. It's a blast. It's super rock and roll. So it's a great opportunity to bring that stuff and feel the fire of a real amp. Real amps are amazing. They're amazing. You feel them behind you. The air moving behind you is amazing. Like, I never want to have a year go by where I don't play a gig with a real amp, right? Because gigs, for me, on a gig, an amp is the thing, especially at a party. When I tour with Eric Hutchinson, he likes to use real amps. We're not on in-ears, and like no stage volume, we're on real amps. But I'll tell you where I think the sim thing is an incredible option, and an option that I have embraced wholeheartedly is in like quiet stage contexts, whether you're in like a variety band, event band, or church, where you're using in-ears and then using something to maybe sound like an amp, or, you're using a simulator, and also in recording. Here's the thing. I'm going to pivot now because I've been talking about amps for a long time. I want to talk to you a little bit about amp simulators, what I love about them. So we know now that it's about context. What's the context you're playing in? Bring the real amp if that's the vibe. If it's not the vibe, get your simulator game together. There's so many things that do it well. I can think of 3 platforms that I really like. The first being the HX Stomp. I have one right here. Line 6 HX Stomp. Now, when I use that product, I'm typically not always using the amps inside of it, but if I'm going for a target, like when I did the Continuum video and did the Pinot lines for SBL, I used a B15 model. When I did the Timmy C video for SBL, I used the SVT model. When I'm playing something on somebody's record that needs to be like amp vibe, I love that pedal, and I love it for a lot of other reasons as well. But the amp sims and cabs in it, people kind of disparage them, but I think they're great. I really think they're great. Now, I haven't had very much interface at all with Fractal or with Kemper or with Quad Cortex Neural DSP, but it's fascinating to me. I'm a bit of a tweaker, so I like to get in and tweak presets and try to, make cool patches. I really do get a kick out of that. But for me, it's like HX Edit, Line 6. The Line 6 ecosystem is the one that I'm the most familiar with. But also, shout out to Origin Effects. They just released 2 pedals called Bass Rig, and one is modeled after a 64 Showman or Bassman Fender amp, and another is modeled after like a late 60s, early 70s SVT, Ampeg SVT. And they are amazing. They're fabulous sounding pedals. I've used them a lot recording. I don't use them live because typically when I'm playing live, I'm playing with an amp. Or if I'm not, I've actually really gotten used to the way DIs sound like in-ears. And so I'm not live almost ever using amp simulation. But for recording, I guess for me, I'm just realizing this. Live, even if I'm on in-ears, in that case, I'm not using an amp, but I am using like a DI. I have a Noble DI, or I have like a Jad Freer DI back here that I really like. And that provides a really clean sound that I know and love. I've learned how to really hear my bass with a DI and judge if I like the sound of it or not. And that with a good pair of in-ears is fine for me. Now, would I love to have an amp blasting at my feet for the feeling of low end? Yes. But I've done enough gigs in a church environment and some live band environment. Like I got a chance to play with Gavin DeGraw for a little while. That was all in-ears, although that was an amp too, but not always. There's a couple gigs that it was just ears. Anyway, I'm perfectly comfortable as long as a mix is good, or I can dial in my mix with in-ears, playing just a DI or amp simulator and not having an actual amp. I think that's fine. But where the amp sim thing comes in for me is recording. I think it's amazing. And I have out here a real SVT, and I have good microphones, and I have a real Ampeg B15 right here. Do I ever mic them up? Ian, do you ever mic them up anymore? I used to. Do I now? No. I don't think I've turned on that forlorn, lonely B15 in like 3 years. Probably all of like the capacitors have dried out, and like I should probably turn it on. I'll turn you on in a minute, okay? I mean, it's crazy. I was talking to John Button about this too. John Button is amazing and a friend of SBL, a friend of mine. He plays bass in a little band you may have heard of called The Who. Dude, The Who. And check it out, man. I mean, he started out in that band playing an SVT and a Marshall to try to do that Entwistle thing. But then they started to tour with an orchestra, and he couldn't have loud amps by the violins. So guess what? He went to HX. I think he went to the Line 6 platform, and now maybe he's in Quad Cortex. I'm not sure. But he went completely Sims for that band. In-ears and amp Sims for that band. And I was talking to him about recording because he has a nice B15. I was like, dude, are you still miking up your B15? He was like, man, actually, the UA, the Universal Audio, which is a platform, makes a plugin of the B15, and it's amazing. And in a way, he's like, I like it better in a way. He's like, I think like I'm not worried about phase in the same way, because when you mic up an amp and combine it with a DI, there's always like a phase thing. You got to move the waves or try to flip the phase, but that doesn't always totally work. And he was just saying, oh, the UA stuff is incredible. And it's funny, I've never even tried that stuff. But the simulators that I have tried and really loved are, again, the Line 6 HX stuff and the Origin stuff. Those two things. And then there's a DI that Jad Freer makes, and it's not trying to do an amp sound, but it has a bit of saturation in it. I mean, of course, everybody knows or has probably heard of the Sans amp. That was one of the originals, right? That was sort of like an amp emulator. And they're very cool. They're more sort of like grindy and farty. They're sort of more distorted sounding and almost sort of mid-scooped. I haven't ever really loved that sound on its own, but in the context, like in a couple of channels where you're using that and maybe another clean DI, it's really great. So for me, is the amp dead? In recording, it almost kind of is, which is so weird and wild. But I would prefer in a recording environment to bring in my pedal board rig and pull up a B15 or SVT or Marshall or whatever model, if that's the vibe of the tune. If we're wanting an ampy, kind of dark or bright in that upper mid-range that an amp is bright, if we're going for that vibe, I would rather do it, quote unquote, fake than real. And it took me a long time to like admit that to myself. For the longest time, I was like, no, the real thing is better. Mic'd up amps is always better. And it's not better. It's just different. Now, there is something about miking up an amp. It's fun. Well, I don't know if it's fun, but it's a process. And people like that process, getting that mic just right, using your preamps, right? Running that microphone into a nice preamp that you may have and getting a cool sound, feeling it in the room, and then listening to it back on tape and convincing yourself that, yeah, the real thing is actually better. I mean, like I say, live, there ain't nothing like the real thing, baby. I mean, it's all about having a big amp if that's the vibe, right? Pushing air, feeling it. But in a studio, I don't know. I kind of like those amp sims. Now, I have definitely had experiences in the studio. I was at a power station on the East Coast where they plugged me into, they have a B15 that's like the house B15, and it sounded incredible. And they took a line from my Noble DI and went into the B15 and combined them and did the phase thing and made it all good. And it was great. But I bet it also would have been cool if I would have run it out of the HX or with an Origin pedal, right? Or some kind of amp simulator. So I think if you're wondering, if you're at the beginning of this journey and you're wondering what to do, let me attempt to save you a bunch of money and time and energy and heartache and despair. I would get a reliable amp. And if aesthetic matters, cool. Find something that looks cool to you. Find a cabinet that is easy enough to lug around, but big enough that's going to provide the right amount of bottom end for the gig that you are going to do. I don't care what any amp manufacturer says. A single 12, this is just me. This is old man Allison. This is, crabby old man Allison talking right now. This is black and white Ian talking right now. There is no single 12-inch cabinet that sounds like a 212, that sounds like a 410, that sounds like a 215, that sounds like an 810. There are these companies that make these outrageous claims that their tiny single 12-inch cabinet, is going to blow you away and you're going to think that it sounds like an 810. It does not. That is marketing BS. If you're an amp manufacturer out there and you think that I'm wrong, send me one. Prove me wrong. But I find that the bigger the cabinet, the bigger the sound. So it's not so much about wattage for me of the actual head, but it's about that cabinet. If you like the sound and the low end of that cabinet, almost any bass head that you're going to put on top of it is going to be totally sufficient. So if you're playing live and you need an amp, find an amp that you like, that you can carry, that feels appropriate vibe-wise, look-wise, and, energy, volume, headroom-wise for the gig that you're doing. And then in the studio, embrace amp sims. Now, that said, if you're playing in church or you're playing in a wedding band or something where you're just on in-ears, well, you might want to get your amp sim game together for those instances, right? Check out the Quad Cortex, check out the Origin pedals, check out the Line 6 pedals. Now, I am not affiliated or get paid by any of these companies, just FYI that I'm talking about. I'm not, plugging the HX. Like, actually, no one from Line 6 has ever reached out to me. Does it hurt your feelings, Ian? It hurts my feelings a little bit. Right? But I'm not affiliated. So please, before I get some big amp deal, which I just feel like might be on the horizon, honestly, with as much as I talk about it, just trust me in saying that all of these platforms are really good. It just depends on what you want. And all amps are really good. It just depends on what you want. But here's what I would do if I were you. I told you I was going to give you some advice and save you money. I would get an amp that serves your needs live. One thing. And I would get it. I wouldn't get an all-tube amp if I were you because they break. What's the most important thing about using an amp live? That it works. Especially if you're using its DI and the whole thing craps out and now you don't have a DI anymore either. It just needs to work. So get something that's reliable, right? That you hear good things about, that you like the vibe of, the look of, that's easy enough to transport if you're doing it by yourself. That probably seems like duh. Now, if you're recording, leave that amp in your car or garage or like storage space, right? And get into some of these amp simulator platforms. Check out the three that I mentioned. I mean, there's HX, there's Origin, there's Quad Cortex, that's Neural DSP. There's also Fractal, there's also Kemper, and there's a bunch of things that, build like amp in a box kind of pedals. But those three, HX, Origin, and Neural DSP, Quad Cortex, are the three that I have had experience with and really like very much for recording. I love if someone is like, hey, do you got kind of like I did this track where it's like, hey, we want it to sort of sound like Entwistle of The Who. Do you have something? And I was like, oh, and I was so happy that I had done a video that had that sound in it, and I spent the time and I pulled it up and bang, and there it was. And you're ready to go. You're not lugging in a giant tube amp that might be staticky or right, and then miking it up and it doesn't sound quite right and the phase is weird with your DI. Oh my God. It's exhausting even talking about, let alone trying to make that happen in the studio. Now, I could be wrong, or I am wrong for some of you. Some of you are like, wow, I've had a very different experience, and you are right. Your experience is valid. Your experience is right. I'm just talking about this from my experience, how I have experienced these things. For me, an amp live, there's nothing better. Happy to go DI if I'm on in-ears, no problem. But in the studio, I am never using amps anymore. I mean, it doesn't mean that I never will. It just means that right now I am perfectly happy with the software solutions. Oh, another one that I mentioned before, but I should include in this too, is UA. That UA stuff is incredible. It's incredible. I haven't even authorized it on my machine, but when I've used it in other studios, I've checked out their B15 and their SVT, and they are remarkable products. And you can get as nerdy as you want, tweaking the amp, the microphone angle, right? And like how close the mic is and how hot the tubes are biased. I mean, all that stuff, you have control of all that stuff. Actually, in most of these platforms, you do. Now, here's the thing. I say that, and if you're thinking, God, now if you've made it this far, you're probably interested in this topic, and you've tuned out long ago if you're not. But check it out. Like some people, they're like, ooh, should I get the HX? And I always say, you should only get one of these products if you're excited about tweaking, if you're a nerd, if you're excited about making presets for different artists and songs and sounds and sessions, and you're going to show up, like I'm about to go do a couple of clinics, and I'm going to show up with this little travel board that I made, and I've got presets for each song with the individual effects that I'm going to kick on and the gain sounds and the amp sounds, and I'm thrilled. I love that stuff. But there are a lot of bass players out there and musicians in general that do not love that. And I've said this before, they would rather eat ground glass than go through the manual for the frickin' HX stomp. And if that is you, don't worry about it. Get the Origin. In that case, those Origin pedals are so simple and amazing, right? And there's no menus to wade through and all that stuff, right? So it just depends on, I would say, only get into that deep dive multi-effect amp sim technology if you are excited to. Not because you hear a lot about it and think you should. Now, that said, if you, like I said, if you want a cool SVT sound, but you don't want to wade through all those parameters, get the Origin. That Origin pedal is amazing. It's called a Bass Rig Vintage, Super Vintage. I think that's what it's called. Yes, the Bass Rig Super Vintage. And also the Fender one is amazing too. That it's Origin based on a Fender Showman, and that is called the 64 panel. I believe, 64 panel and Super Vintage. Both of those products are incredible. If you don't want to do the menu deep dive, right? It's totally fine if you don't want to do that. So, and it's like, now I could talk for another hour about in-ears and getting your ears molded for custom in-ears. But I think I'm not going to do that. I'm going to leave it here. Look. We get so many great messages from you guys telling us what you like, what you don't like about the podcast. I would sure love to know how you felt about this episode. Is this too much down the gear rabbit hole? Even though if it is down the gear rabbit hole, do you still enjoy it? What are some things that you would love to hear Scott and I talk about, or Scott on his own, or me on my own pontificating about here on the SBL podcast? We would love to know. And check it out. Leave us a review, subscribe to the pod wherever you check out the pod. It really helps us get the word out. Send it to a friend. Do you have, maybe you listen to this and you're like, oh boy, that episode wasn't for me, but it would be for Paul. Send this to Paul. Paul, I got you, man. Send this to your friend. If you think somebody would enjoy this podcast, please share it. It really helps us out. Hey, thanks a lot for listening. I've really enjoyed myself today, and hope you have a great rest of your day or night wherever you are in the world. Cheers, everybody. Thanks so much for listening.